Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the York Union. This is our third event this term. Just wanted to say thank you very much for the donations. We're a not-for-profit organisation, so the money that comes from you is basically reinvested back in, so we can get some wow speakers like Steve Nallon tonight. So let me introduce him. Steve Nallon, formidable name, actor, comedian, actor again. He was on Spitting Image for 12 years before it ended in 1996. It had views of 14 million viewers each episode, which Downton Abbey and X Factor combined can barely handle. So it was a social, political phenomenon at the time. So we're very privileged to welcome him to the York Union tonight. He'll be talking about what makes people laugh, and hopefully he'll throw in a few amusing anecdotes from his time at Spitting Image. Thank you very much.
I want to begin with a story that was told by Groucho Marx, the American comedian. And Groucho Marx was asked, what's the difference? What's the difference between the sense of humour of a normal person and the sense of humour of a comedian? And he said, he said, a normal person will laugh at a man who's dressed up as a little old lady in a wheelbarrow, careering down a road and crashing into a brick wall. For a comedian to laugh, it's got to be a real old lady. So, what's the point he's making then? I don't think he's saying that comedians only laugh at real pain and real misfortune. I think what he's saying is that because comedians deal in comedy, the comedian can see through the disguise. In this case, it's a literal disguise, a man dressed up as a woman. But in most comedy, you will find a disguise of some sort. And what the disguise does is it smuggles in a truth. That truth may well be a violent truth, as in the case of the man dressed up. Or it may be a sexual truth, or a political truth. But somehow the disguise smuggles it in. And I think that what Groucho Marx was really saying was that comedians understand not only the mechanism, as it were, of the joke, but also what the joke is really saying. What is the joke actually suggesting? Now, the mechanism of most jokes is a play on words, and the academic term for this, if you want to write it down, is migration of meaning. But basically, what you have is, depending on the context of the word, you will obviously find a different meaning. Jokes will move or migrate, as it were, when the meaning changes. Okay, one basic formula for this is what I call the literal truth. I mention this mechanism because if there's anyone here who's interested in writing comedy or getting involved in comedy, this is a formula that you can do quite easily. It's not very difficult to actually create jokes based on the literal truth. And the formula works like this. You take a common phrase that everybody uses in a metaphorical or a figurative way, but then somehow you turn that figurative meaning into a literal one. I'll give you an example. An example from a play by Alan Bennett called 40 Years On. And in this play, some students are putting on a review. And the headmaster keeps interrupting the students because he doesn't like the jokes. He finds the jokes a bit dirty. In fact, he wants to get rid of and ban one of these jokes. And as he's leaving the stage, having banned one of the jokes, he turns and says, "Really," he said, "really, if you have to go to the lavatory for humour, the writing's on the wall." The headmaster believes that he is using that phrase figuratively, writing on the wall, meaning that that things are looking pretty doom-laden. But in the context of the situation, the sentence itself, the headmaster is inadvertently telling the students where they can find the best dirty jokes. So you can see what has happened in there. In that very, very, very simple joke, the meaning has changed the context, and smuggled in is the idea that the headmaster is the expert on dirty jokes. The comedian that many of you will be familiar with that basically does this a great deal is a comedian called Tim Vine. Do you know Tim Vine? I'll give you an example of one of his jokes. A guy said to me, he said, "I'm going to chop off the bottom of one of your trouser legs and put it in a library." I thought, oh, that's a turn up for the book. But you can see what he's done there, can't you? You can see what he's done in a very formulaic way, frankly. He's taken the phrase turn up for the book, and he's thought, how can I turn that figurative idea into a literal meaning? Another example that he does is, I phoned the local gym the other day and I asked if they could teach me to do the splits. They said, "How flexible are you?" I said, "I can't do Mondays." That is slightly, I think that's less successful actually as a joke, because it's comedians, lots of comedians use that formula anyway. And actually by the time you hear splits and hear the word flexible, you're almost ahead of the game. You're almost, he's going to go in that direction. But once you understand, as I say, the formula for these jokes, you can actually create your own. In Edinburgh this year, Tim Vine won the best joke of Edinburgh out of 7,000 jokes. And the joke was this: "I decided to sell my Hoover. Well, it was just collecting dust." I wonder why it won, giving that response from the audience. The reason I mention this is I'm sure that Tim Vine believed that he had created an original joke. But lots of comedian friends of mine, slightly more from the old school, said, "Well, I did that joke in Panto in 1968. That's not a new joke." But you can see how that joke was created. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Because I want to do now is actually to take us all back to when we first laughed. As a human being, when did you first laugh? And I want to answer that by going back to when we are babies. And remember, we learnt to laugh even before we learnt to talk. Now, the best way to get a baby to laugh is to play a game called Peekaboo. And basically what happens in Peekaboo is that babies have at a certain age, quite a young age, have very limited spatial awareness. And basically what this means is that in practice, if you put your hands in front of your face, in front of a baby, the baby doesn't understand the concept of behind. He has no concept of behind. So when you suddenly appear again, it's as if you've disappeared and suddenly appeared. So what you do is you put your hands in front of the face. Mummy or daddy, but it's new mummy. Mummy puts the hands in front of the face. Baby looks worried because mummy's disappeared. Suddenly the hands are released. Mummy's suddenly there. Baby's happy and laughs. And normally, of course, the mother is laughing at the same time. So what we have here is the very first key word, if you like, of this talk, and that is the word surprise. Obvious in a way, but it's a very key word in comedy. And the other is release. At least in this sense of release, of relief, because the baby is quite pleased that the mother is back. Also in the game of Peekaboo, as I said, the mother is normally laughing at the same time. So the baby laughs, the mother's laughing, and everybody's laughing. But I want to come back to that idea a bit later. Anyway, for now, let's stick to the concept of surprise. Or another way of saying surprise is reversal. Reversal of the expected outcome. I would say that at this stage of a baby's development, and I've read some research on this, I'm not doing it, but I've read some, I would say that I don't think the baby has any sense of comedy. Nor a sense of humour, but what it is developing is a sense of fun in that surprise. In comedy, surprise then is your first and very basic comic technique. What happens in most jokes is that you are taken down one path, a certain expectation is set up, and suddenly there is a reversal of that expectation and you are surprised. If you want the academic terminology, you migrate to an unexpected meaning, giving rise to surprise and, of course, laughter. Which brings me to, I don't know if you know this term, lots of comedians use it, the rule of three. And it's known as the rule of three in comedy, because basically what you have in the rule of three is you have one idea that establishes, one idea that reinforces, and a third that will surprise you and take you in a different direction. They're less common nowadays because you don't get them on television, but you'll get a Jew, a Catholic and a Protestant went on a train journey. Or you will get an Englishman, an Irishman and a Scotsman, whatever. And what basically will happen in that joke is you'll take racial characteristics from the first, racial characteristics from the second, and on the third one there'll be some sort of twist. I'll give you an example. 2 Englishmen, 2 Americans and 2 French people were left on a desert island for about 20 years. And after 20 years they came back to the island. And they went to the first island, to the American island, and on the American island there was Burger King, there was McDonald's, there were all these fast food chains with neon lights. Oh, it's really interesting. So they go on to the next island, the French island, and there is these wonderful 5-star Michelin hotels, smells of garlic, frogs jumping about and all that. Oh, that's very clean. So they go to the third island with the 2 Englishmen. And the 2 Englishmen are still sat on the beach. And the guy said, well, what's the problem? And one says, oh, we haven't been introduced. 2 things I'd say about that. The whole fast food thing was a complete red herring. That is guiding you down an idea, oh, this joke's going to be about British food. The joke wasn't about British food. The joke was really about the nature or the perceived nature of what it's like to be English or British, that rather reserved nature. They haven't been introduced. Manners in English society is key important. Maybe in 20 years that joke won't work, because the English perception of what is English will have changed. It's a racial joke. I don't think it's racist, but it's certainly a racial joke, but it's looking at the nature of what it's like to be English. Sometimes these formats become so familiar, you get versions about the mechanism itself. For example, an Englishman, an Irishman and a Scotsman went into the bar, and the barman said, "Is this some sort of joke?" And interestingly, when President Obama spoke at Westminster Hall a couple of years ago, he began his speech by saying, only three people have spoken at Westminster Hall before. The Queen, Nelson Mandela and Winston Churchill, which is either a very high bar or the opening of a very good joke. Interestingly, you laughed less the second time, because actually it's the same joke. Comedians, I was listening to, I've worked with John Cleese, and he's a miserable bugger, to be honest, but and one of the reasons I think he's a miserable bugger is because he spent his life in comedy, and almost nothing he was saying now makes him laugh, because he hears comedians and he just knows what they've done. He sort of knows all the formats, he knows how the rules, and so when I hear that line that President Obama said, ooh, excitement. There's something really flash there, I'll just let you know that. In a sense, that's the downside of being a comedian. Lots of comedians never laugh at jokes. They'll listen to a joke and say, that's very funny. They won't necessarily. Anyway, I'm digressing. And worse, I'm digressing without laughs. So I'll move on. Oh yeah, a very quick rule of three joke. Doesn't have to be very elaborate, but this is a rule of three joke. It's about a Christian. It's about a Christian guy who had 3 daughters. And you can tell when he lost his faith because they were called Faith, Hope and Doris. The credit to that should go to David Lodge. It's in one of David Lodge's Catholic novels. But you can see how the very simple rule of three operating in that sense. So, another quick point about the rule of three. One is it's based on the mathematical principle, the need for three to create a series, and two, technically, what laughter is the release of tension in the throat. So you need the first section and the second section. That actually builds up the tension, which you need to physically create the laughter. Let me move on to the next stage, I think, in comedy, when you're young, is as a toddler. There's a moment when a toddler sometimes just falls over, trying to walk but can't. He falls over and falls on his bum. If you're clever enough as a parent, you will get there just in time to start laughing at the toddler, in the hope that the toddler won't start crying, but start laughing. So what you have here, and it's learnt as this, it's not instinctive. I think the peekaboo is more instinctive, this is more learnt. What you have here is the baby or the young toddler thinking one response to failure and pain is to laugh. That's what you do. That's what mummy and daddy is showing you to do, because they're doing it. Often it doesn't work and the baby cries anyway. But what you also have here in this situation is bonding, social bonding. The child is encouraged to laugh by the parent laughing with him. But let's actually concentrate on this idea of laughter being some sort of a coping mechanism to deal with failure. It is, I think, a key word here is release. And it actually quite complicated ideas, because as grown-ups, we use laughter to cope with failure. And sometimes, I think, we use laughter to celebrate failure. Let me give you some examples. There's two ways of laughing at, for example, the Chuckle Brothers, or Lord and Hardy, or Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. And how you laugh depends on your own personality and the way you look at the world. The first way of laughing is to see what's happening to Lord and Hardy, or the Chuckle Brothers, or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and think, oh God, life's like that, isn't it? Ain't life like that? Something similar happened to me. I dropped something, then life's like that. And then you laugh, and in a way you're laughing with them. The second way of thinking is, God, they're idiots. I'm glad I'm not an idiot like that. He's a real idiot, but I'm not. That way you're laughing at them. So when people make distinction between laughing with and laughing at, I think there is the two distinctions. And that frankly depends on your own personality. Dame Edna, of course, has that wonderful phrase. I'll quickly do the impression. I have a gift, I do. I have a gift, and that is the ability to laugh at the misfortunes of others. And what you have with Dame Edna is cruel comedy. That's really cruel comedy. I have no problem with it, but that is really cruel comedy. Which leads me to another key aspect of comic theory, and that is superiority, or a sense of superiority. Laughter gives you a sense of superiority over the person you are laughing at. And that happens in all sorts of social groupings. And actually it creates a social hierarchy as well. So as I say, you can laugh at Laurel and Hardy and share what's happening with them because it's happened to you, or you just think they're complete idiots. Okay, let's forget Laurel and Hardy, but let's now move that idea of superiority on to look at Irish jokes. Or in Ireland they call them Kerrigan jokes. You don't get Irish jokes in America, but you get what is known as Polack jokes. They're all the same jokes. They're about people who are perceived to be stupid. Freud said that these sort of jokes exist to maintain the status quo by ridiculing deviant social behaviour. Henry Bergson, the philosopher, said that laughter in this sense is a corrective. You're there actually to correct abnormal behaviour and bring it back, as it were, to normality. Personally, I think that the most successful British sitcoms, for example, over many years, has a slightly warmer aspect. The key is about failure. Most British sitcoms are about failure. The Dad's Army, Fawlty Towers, Only Fools and Horses, The Office to some degree. The Office is slightly more cruel, but it seems to me that the most popular sitcoms of British history have all depended on the failure and a warm sense of failure, because we know guys like that. The ultimate comic failure, I think, is in the plays of Samuel Beckett, where the failure is bleak. But I just want to go back to Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, because when I was young, I used to love Tom and Jerry. I never really got Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. As I've got older, that changed round. Because I look now at those cartoons and they're my favourite, because Wile E. Coyote is so clever, he is so inventive, and Roadrunner is so stupid. But guess what? With the battle between Tom and Jerry, they're both inventive. Roadrunner doesn't do anything. He just runs. It's so annoying. And Wile E. Coyote is so clever. And it's fortune. It is fortune, not the intelligence of Roadrunner, that causes the problem. And he always fails. Relentless fails. And I suppose as I've got older, I've learned to laugh more at that sort of failure than I did when I was younger. Anyway, we've looked so far at babies laughing and toddlers laughing. Let me introduce a slightly new concept. And I noticed this when my niece was about 7 or 8. And my niece was about 7 or 8, and she loved grapes. And she was eating some grapes like that. And she finished the grapes, and then she turned the thing upside down and said, "Look, a tree." What she had done was one of the key aspects of comedy, and that is she had seen one thing in terms of another. She'd seen that what was a stalk actually looked like a tree. And what you have here is, in the academic terminology, a concurrence of meaning within a biformity. Basically what you have is an incongruity, where two things come together but exist at the same time. If anybody wants some comic advice, I would say that what they have to do in life is look at everything. People, images, language, voices, songs, and hear and see a different meaning within whatever they're seeing. See something and find a different meaning within it. Peter Kay does a wonderful routine where he takes songs that he has listened to, and he heard different lyrics to the original lyrics, and he plays he tells you what he heard, and then he plays what he heard. And when you're listening to that, you can suddenly hear what Peter Kay heard, even though the lyrics are completely different. And sometimes they're absurd. I'm sure it'll be on YouTube, so go and have a look. So as I say, this idea is really about duality, biformity, and incongruity. And you transpose one idea and put it in another. Comedians often begin, for example, a routine by saying, establishing one idea, and they'll say, and it's like this. That idea is like this. And they'll develop the comparison between the two things. Next time you're watching a comedian on television, notice how often they do that. And it's like this. That idea is like this. And they'll play with the connections between the two things. Eddie Izzard used to do a fantastic routine when he first started, which takes this to absurd extremes. And in a completely surreal direction. He took cats purring behind the couch, He said, "Do you know what cats are doing when they're purring behind the couch?" That simple idea. They're drilling for oil. And then he got 20 minutes material out of turning purring cats behind the sofa into this wonderful, surreal thing of the cats drilling for... And of course, he got gags within the drilling and all the rest of it. Well, that's a bit of comic genius, but you can do that to agree with yourself. So as I say, what's important is the ability to make connections between things that are disparate and incongruous. I want to change direction for a second and forget about babies and toddlers and so on. And now ask, when was it that mankind first laughed? Well, we have to be speculative. But one theory is that the noise that we make when we laugh, in very, very early development, was actually a noise that said danger was over. I'll offer you a very quick scenario. Imagine a load of guys are hunting for a wild boar, and when they're hunting for a wild boar, the boar gets one of the guys and is about to kill the guy, and the others are all cowering in the background because of, a big wild boar. And from nowhere comes a tiger, jumps on the wild boar, and kills it. The guys run off, and they get a safe distance from the tiger. And then they utter this sound, which the first time they uttered it into mankind, they go, that sound is the sound of tension being released, but it is also the sound that the danger is over. We were in danger, but we're no longer in danger. And then as they're walking back to the village, what they do is they start sort of acting out what happened. They start pointing to the guy who was attacked by the boar and go, at him. And then the guy that was attacked by the boar turns around to the cowards who didn't help him and go, ha 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 ha. And then they make fun of the boar that thought he was going to eat his dinner, and then he was the one that got eaten. Classic reversal, ha 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 ha, on the boar. What you've got here is this concept of target. This is another key aspect of comedy, the target. So let's develop this concept of a target. Let me first talk about social bonding, because what's also happening in this group of guys is that they are bonding in a very sort of social way, and laughter allows that to connect. As students, some of you are students tonight, others are not, but you'll know if you're not. One of the things you do in Freshers Week, you meet somebody for the first time, you possibly go to a comedy night, and what will happen, you'll stand at the back and somebody will tell a joke, and the students will look at each other and go, are you laughing with me at the same thing? Because if you're laughing with me at the same thing, we can probably be friends. That happened. You're laughing over there, you're thinking, oh God, you did that. And that's what we do. It happens on hen nights and stag nights, army, and in politics. And what happens is the many become one through laughter. It happens at a football match when you're all cheering. But in comedy too, the many become one. And they become one, not through cheering like a football match, but they become one through laughter. One other aspect of social bonding that's worth mentioning, actually, because the thing is, I mention these terms, but actually within it there's so many sort of subdivisions and variations, but the false laughter you give when you've gone too far, and you go, so I didn't mean it, it's always false, is that laughter? It sounds false, it doesn't sound like real laughter when people do that. That's part of social bonding. It's a slightly different aspect of social bonding, because you say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I've gone too far, ha ha ha. Again, it's like, please give me the all clear. It's a false alarm, I wasn't being serious, and it sort of does go back to that sound. Let's develop the social bonding in group situations. Politicians very famously use self-deprecation to make fun of themselves, which allows them then to target others. But social bonding, there's a great scene actually in Goodfellas, which is all about social bonding. And it's when Joe Pesci is telling a very, very funny story. And everybody's laughing. You remember the scene? Everybody's laughing at this scene. And at the end of the scene, and all these the mafia guys are all laughing, and Ray Liotta turns and says, "Oh, you're a funny guy." And then Joe Pesci says, "What? What did you say? I'm a funny guy? You think I'm some sort of clown?" And the whole atmosphere completely changes. And, you know, there's a bit of character going on there with Pesci. And you realise that that isn't quite what normal people do. And then he said, "I got you," and then they all laugh again. But what's going on in that scene is social pecking order. Joe Pesci is establishing where he is and actually essentially keeping Ray Liotta down. It's a very good example of sort of seeing social bonding with laughter. In a group situation then, if you're with friends on a night out, whether it's a hen night or a stag night or any sort of night, you can make fun of your friends. That's part of the deal when you're a group. Supposing some guy or some woman or whatever comes over and starts making fun of somebody in that group, saying the same thing, then you will sort of turn on the guy. Because the basic principle is it's okay to make fun of the people in your group, but not from outside. This takes us on to a much bigger principle. Blacks tell jokes about blacks. Gays tell jokes about gays. Jews about Jews. But to what extent, this is really a question, to what extent is it the joke that matters over who is telling it? Personally, I think there's the logic of not being able to tell the same joke even though you're an outsider. If you were inside the group, you could tell it. But if you're outside the joke, you're not outside the group. You're somehow not allowed to tell it. I find that illogical, but some people find it morally objective. Probably my favourite comedian is a guy called Jerry Sadovich, who told jokes about everybody, and vicious and horrible they are too. But we sort of give him, he never appears on television, it's too dangerous. But in Edinburgh, he's adored in Edinburgh, and all comedians go, and he's fine about everybody, but and about himself too, and it's great. And I sort of prefer that really edgy side of comedy. But anyway, let's go back to looking at some targets. People, celebrities, politicians. You can attack professions, hate figures. It used to be estate agent, it's now bankers. It's sort of changed. Places, well, in this area it gets slightly dodgy in terms of sort of the groups you can attack or the nations you can attack. You can also attack ideas, target ideas, vegetarianism, capitalism, it doesn't really matter. What you will find, if you made a list of those things you attack, is a sort of a division between attacking up, and attacking up basically means you're attacking the royal family and politicians and the wealthy and those in power who are seen to be superior. You're attacking up your superiors, as it were. And those that attack down, people who have less power, people who are perceived to have a lower situation, the Irish and gays and women. It's interesting actually that the more modern school of comedy will attack up, but the old school, I'm talking about old school in 1960s, 1970s, they on the whole used to attack down. And there was suddenly in the 80s, in the early 80s, there was sort of this change around where comedy changed from making fun of the Irish and mothers-in-law and all the rest of it to making fun of, which I did for a living for many, many years, politicians. I ask you a question here. When you're doing jokes like that, are you challenging perceptions or are you enforcing them? Or is there a bit of both that's going on? In a sense, the old school, I think, used to reinforce perceptions about the Irish being stupid and mother-in-laws being fat and ugly, whereas actually the more modern comedians, I think, tend to be more challenging of your perceptions. Another aspect of social bonding is observational humour, which works in a slightly different way. Michael McIntyre and Peter Kay are perfect examples of this. And basically what you get with both of them is shared observation. So Peter Kay will say, "Do you remember when?" That will be his attitude. Or that Michael McIntyre said, have you ever noticed about roundabouts? And you go, oh, I share that, I share that. We all share that. Fascinating was I showed a friend of mine who came from a very wealthy, upper middle class background, what I found very funny, which was Peter Kay at Blackpool Tower. He hadn't a clue what was going on. Or every social reference, he just didn't understand. And he was absolutely silent. And actually, when you watch, if you put Peter Kay in the wrong audience, he'd die his arse. He really would. Because basically we are all different, which brings me to the next part of the talk, which is the psychological theory of laughter. I make the basic point that it wasn't until after human beings started to wear clothes that people started to make jokes about nudists. And basically what I'm sort of saying is the psychological theory of laughter depends on our own repression, our own angst, and our own anxiety. In Freudian theory, the degree of repression or anxiety directly relates to the measure of laughter that arises from the joke. Or put simply, you tell me your favourite joke, and I'll tell you who you are. Ask yourself, what is it that really makes you laugh? And you'll find something about yourself if you are able to answer that honestly. And of course, psychological humour, not surprisingly, covers areas that involve sexual humour and scatological humour. I never get fart joke. I have never got a fart joke in my life. And I spoke to a friend of mine, Chris Barry, who was on Spitting Image. Great, lovely guy, lovely comedian. And I said, Chris, why do you find fart jokes so funny? I just don't get them. And he said, were you ever in a boarding school? I said, no, I never went to boarding school. He said, well, there you are, you see. If you're at a boarding school, you've got 12 guys in the room, all farting. And all you do is spend all night laughing, and, you know, and it just never, and he said, that's why. And I sort of now understand, actually, why so many people I've worked with in comedy who come from that background find fart jokes incredibly funny. I never went through that, so, you know, it's not really my area. One thing I'd say, though, that we are in the area, even with farts, of taboo comedy. Interestingly, with taboo comedy, that we often find a special place or time for it. In the old days, we used to put it at the end of the pier. Comedy clubs, you have to go downstairs in a bar in Soho. Even Spitting Image was put on at a special time, 10 o'clock on ITV on a Sunday night. And this was the time that also the New Statesman was put on. And it was almost as if, and they were conscious of this, were at ITV saying, oh, this is our half hour and we're allowed to do this. If you'd have put it on at maybe 8 o'clock on a Monday, it wouldn't have been allowed. Oh, but it's the end of the weekend. This is the time when we're allowed to make fun of Mrs. Thatcher. Oh, no. Yes, it's a bit offensive, but it's only this 1/2 hour that we're allowed to do that. As I say, I think that we sort of miss that because television is so sort of homogenous now. I think we might... I'll tell you one joke that's a political joke as well, because it's not my favourite political joke, but it shows you the power and the danger of politics. Nobody on Spitting Image ever got arrested. We were given permission to do it, collective permission to do it, and we can talk about that in a minute. And yet I want to mention a comedian you may not have heard of called Zargan Gar, who's a Burmese comedian. Now, Burmese is the most repressive organisation, most oppressive nation in the world, or one of them. And he told this joke, and he's now in prison for it. And the joke goes like this. A man gets a visa from Burma to go to India. And as soon as he gets off the plane, he goes to a dentist. He goes to the dentist, and the dentist says, hang on, why you come to a dentist? Surely you have dentists in Burma. He said, oh yes, we have dentists in Burma, but we're not allowed to open our mouth. That joke put him in prison. And to my knowledge, he still is. not a necessarily great moment to end, so I shall make one other basic point before I finish, and we get some questions. There's a phrase that people use: did you get the joke? Did you get the joke? Did you understand what was going on? Because actually one aspect of why we laugh is the fact that laughter can be a reward to ourselves for actually getting the joke. And this is called the theory of configuration. And basically the configuration works where you fill in the gap, or you fill in that bit, you work out what the comedy is. There's a wonderful comedian called Bob Newhart, American comedian who's still going. He used to do a routine which is basically one-sided conversations. And the comedy used to come from you listening to that one-sided conversation on the phone and working out what was going on the other end of the phone. And that's the comedy of configuration. And you'll find this joke, which I'm going to tell you now, probably in every student rag that's ever been written. Two nuns in a bath. Two nuns in the bath. And one says to the other, "Where's the soap?" And the other one says, "Yes, doesn't it?" Well, you're laughing, you got it. It's actually quite a clever joke, actually. It's not a pleasant joke, I'm not saying it is. Whereas, oh, that's what she's doing with the soap. It's wearing it out. As a kid, as a teenager, somebody told me that joke, and I laughed. Didn't understand it. You know, it's what is known as a parcel force joke. You'll get it in the morning. That did get a laugh, I'm so pleased. I only put that line in this afternoon. So, very, very quickly, is there an overriding thing? Because I've talked about superiority and release and biformity and incongruity. Is there a basic idea that I can sort of leave you with this talk, which sort of summarises everything? You know, it's just one phrase. And I can say there is. And it's what comedians call the comic gap. And the comic gap is where all comedy lives. It's where all comedy lies. And the comic gap is basically the difference between what we wanted to happen and what actually did happen. It's the difference between aim and achievement. It's the difference between what we want and what we get. And in a way you can see that brings together superiority, release, surprise, and incongruity. And if you can find the difference and the comic gap in every aspect of life, that will be the beginning of your life in comedy.